Here. So again, welcome everyone. This is our workshop, Style and Substance, Language and Description in LGBTQ+ Archives. Our workshop today is part of the Hidden Histories Project, which is a partnership between ONE and LA as Subject to document and uncover LGBTQ+ archival collections and materials across Southern California. The project has been generously funded by a grant from the California State Library. With me today are Isaac Fellman of the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco and Megan Needles, formerly of the GLBT Historical Society and currently an archivist with the San Francisco Cinematheque. So I am going to start things off today with a discussion of the benefits of using inclusive language to describe archival collections. Excuse me 1 minute. Benefit of using inclusive description on archival collections, the language and vocabulary used to describe LGBTQ+ collections, how to locate and update this description to improve the discoverability and promote representation. Then Megan and Isaac will talk to you about the work that they have been doing in exactly this area, creating controlled vocabulary and subject headings at the GLBT Historical Society that is better reflective of both their collections and their community. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the session. We do ask that you hold all questions until then or write them in the chat for us to come back to. So to get things started, what is archival description? How do we define it? What is its purpose? The Society of American Archivists defines archival description as the process of capturing, collating, analyzing, and organizing any information that serves to identify, manage, locate, and interpret the holdings of archival institutions and explain the context and record systems from which those holdings were selected. More simply, the purpose of archival description is to make information in and about collections accessible. It is primarily found in finding aids, but is not limited to that location. And it's essentially anything that provides information about, gives access to, or gives context to a collection, its creator, and its relationships to other materials. Description has been referred to as a surrogate for materials or a roadmap to a collection, but I prefer Wendy Duff and Vern Harris's take that description is storytelling. It is data about data to tell a story about a story. We find and infer information from collections and the context of materials and produce description. The interpretation and the language used in creating this description can change the meaning of historical materials. It's created at a particular time to suit particular needs and audiences, and it can have tremendous influence over the reception and use of the materials that it describes. So if archival description is the stories and the names we give to collections and materials, it's important to understand our relationship and responsibilities in that naming as the keepers of collections. The terms used by archivists when arranging and describing LGBTQ+ materials affect how researchers find and perceive these collections. When archival description is created by those outside of the LGBTQ+ community and without consideration or consultation with those stakeholders, it's not unusual for bias to creep in. And as a result, biased stories continue to be told and users can learn negative stereotypes. It's not active or malicious. It's often unrecognized or unexamined bias that is perpetuated through unexamined descriptive terms. Additionally, description that doesn't use the terms used by LGBTQ community members to identify themselves, whether that's through outdated terms or through omission, it does render the materials more difficult to find and impedes access. One of the tools that we can use to combat this is Michelle Caswell and Marika Seaforth's concept of radical empathy, which is the idea that you should be examining your relationship to collections, to donors, and to researchers, placing yourself in their shoes. All three of these actors are integral to creating meaning, and their interactions and reactions should be considered. The relationships are complex, multifaceted, and multidimensional. Radical empathy involves recognizing your own identity as the archivist or cataloger and how it connects or doesn't connect to the LGBTQ plus community. And also recognizing how existing description doesn't serve researchers or does serve researchers or honor the donor's intent in giving their papers. And we all know there's power in names, the names we give ourselves, the names other people give us or that we give others, and in the reclamation of names. In LGBTQ plus description, it is vital to respect the self-identifications of donors, use original historically accurate terminology whenever available. Now, if those terms don't fall within your controlled vocabulary, as opposed to something like someone uses genderqueer as opposed to transgender, or they self-identify as a dyke rather than a lesbian, you can include these terms in additional access points, such as the historical note, the biographical note, the content description, which allows you to maximize the description, but maintain an ease of findability. It's also an excellent way to include multiple terms where a donor has self-identified many different ways over the course of their life. On the other side of this, we also have to respect a donor's choice not to identify themselves, which you often see in older materials where language was inadequate, harmful, possibly even dangerous to self-identify. Agency and self-determination are crucial aspects of someone's ability to describe their own identity. So terms should not be imposed on individuals based on our own limited knowledge or interpretation of others' behaviors and expressions. With interpretation based simply on clues, there's always a risk of misinterpretation or misrepresentation. We can't necessarily know that the people represented would choose the names that we would give them. K.J. Rawson, I really like this quote, says, "Here we face the paradox of queer archiving. How do we resist and transform normative archival description practices without recreating newer but still equally damaging or silencing practices?" Which leads us to some of the words and language that we use in the LGBTQ plus community. It's diverse, and segments within the community have used a wide variety of names, some of which have been assigned to us, and some of which we have created for ourselves. New terms and phrases have been developed to better define our identities. Words that have been assigned by normative society are recognized as harmful and discarded or reclaimed. One of the greatest challenges with regard to assigning subject headings is that the LGBTQ plus community does not internally agree on a specific set of terms. For instance, many members use the term queer to describe all non-heteronormative sexual practice and non-binary gender identities. It is accepted in academic and other circles as an umbrella term, but there are some in the community who still feel that queer is harmful and pejorative and do not accept it as an identifier. So the terms are constantly changing. Terms used both by and about communities are usually created to either describe the internal or the external, who is accepted, who is outside. Terms come from many places, but often get traded back and forth. They shift from common to outdated, accepted to pejorative, and sometimes back again. The word gay is an example of this. The word homosexual and homosexuality, which are still found in some technical terminology, but have a diminished use due to negative connotations from religious, medical, and religious contexts. The word homophile, which was a word adopted in the 50s and 60s as an alternative to homosexual because it focused on phile, love, rather than sex. But that's also fallen out of use, overshadowed by other newer language. And some terms have evolved as a response to slurs and homophobic language, ways to overshadow those negatives with our own positive language. The language and terms within the LGBTQ plus community were born out of a need to connect with other members of the community, but also a need to protect, a need for secrecy and safety. Over time, the language gets used, as it gets used in public, it becomes common parlance. It becomes less recognized as the LGBTQ plus community terminologies and is appropriated into other segments of society, which then inspires the creation of new terms to use internally. Different coded or euphemistic language, things that are used by the community, about the community, whether that is a euphemism such as peacock or strong-minded, which were used in historical accounts of early Los Angeles to describe gay, lesbian, transgender people, or the more derogatory words used as an expression of contempt for homosexual behavior like sissies or fairies. In terms of words used by the community itself, the terminologies adopted by the communities are sometimes referred to as lavender languages, which has become its own branch of linguistic study. Lavender languages function as a kind of code, characterized by acronyms, by plays on words, by double meanings, things that are really only intended to be understood by the communities that are using them. In some cases, entire languages have been created to facilitate communication, such as Polari in the UK in the 1950s and 60s, Swardspeak in the Philippines, Lubunka in Turkey, and in South Africa, 2 languages have developed along racial lines, and Gael. As the language evolves and new terms and phrases are created to redefine identities, generational divides are starting to appear on both sides. Whether it is the reclamation and creation of terms by the younger generation that previous ones either still find harmful, or they're unwilling to adopt or learn a new term, or the reverse, terms in common use by older members of the community that have been deemed unacceptable by the younger generation or just outdated. As communication and connection broadens engagement with the issues of sex and gender, we're also seeing a shift away from gendered terms and a broadening of traditionally gendered terms such as femme to be more neutral and inclusive over non-gendered identifiers. And I think over time, archival description is going to start to reflect this, if only because the people pioneering these terms are eventually going to be sitting in the places that we're all sitting now. So this is a very non-exhaustive list of older terms that have been used to reference members of the community. Most have been discarded as unacceptable or fallen out of common parlance for other reason. Some of them are very vague. They could reference other groups in a different context. Some of them are inherently sexual, and many of them cast aspersions on individuals who exist outside traditional gender presentations and roles. But they're all words that you may see in perusing older records if you are looking for the terms to place the context around your materials. So, but in many cases, especially older records, there may not be any clear vocabulary. There may only be implications or oblique references. There will be some outdated or harmful words like the ones we've discussed. Police records, medical records, they don't label things as homosexual or related terms. They detail performance or solicitation of quote unquote deviant sexual practices, or refer to diseases or psychological conditions, which is how homosexuality was treated in the past. In remembering to be mindful of your internal bias, keeping your eyes open, keeping your mind open, you can find other ways of seeing as you go through collections and sort of read between the lines. And I have a few examples from one's own collections to give you an idea of what it is I'm talking about. So this is Baba Singh. He's a Southeast Asian man who was arrested in 1914 in San Francisco for the somewhat dubious crime of infamous crimes against nature. At the time, this was an umbrella term that criminalized a range of sexual behaviors, but particularly homosexuality. And if you look to the right, if you look next to the red box, you can see they actually sentenced him to 6 years for a fairly vague offense. This is a nicer example. This photo was taken in 1942, sent by a Navy man named Jack Block from his naval post to Max Gundy. And the inscription reads, "To Max, words cannot express my thoughts. As ever, Jack. Now, during World War II, soldiers, Navy men, they weren't able to openly express their affection for the opposite sex, but they still wanted to write home to their loved ones. So inscriptions on photos like this or sign-offs on love letters contain more oblique references. There's another collection at one, which includes correspondence between two soldiers during World War II. Many of the letters and telegrams replace the words "I love you" with the words "you know what." And as another example, these are listings from the classified publication Contacts Clearinghouse of Friendship. It was classified listings for people looking for pen pals, new friends, other connections. The copies we have in our collection have been marked by which entries are believed to be gay or possibly gay. As you can see, the little question marks, the little check marks. The donor went through looking at context clues, looking at phrasing, and made those notes on the listings. We can't be 100% sure that these entries are from members of the LGBTQ plus community, but in some cases, say in this post where the gentleman in question says he has been favored by nature with an immunity to female charms, there's an inference to be made there. I also really enjoy the one below it where the gentleman says he's slightly screwy and looking to meet friends similarly afflicted. Is he queer? Is he just kind of weird? We'll never know, but it is there to read if you are looking for it. Now, based on these single points of reference on all of these materials, with no additional context, you can't say with 100% certainty that these people are LGBTQ+. But with critical reading, you can see implications, you can make references. Now, viewing classification and cataloging through a queer perspective, it challenges the idea that description and subject language can never be corrected once and for all. The language is constantly evolving, and we're aiming for inclusive, but what that means is also changing. And inclusive description is really about embracing the work. You start by critically reading your own subject headings and controlled vocabularies and accepting that there is likely work to do. The more recently you've done an internal audit, the easier it's going to be, but the older collection has been in the catalog, the more likely it is to benefit from a refresher. Don't limit yourself to what's provided by Library of Congress subject headings or other large-scale vocabularies. Local vocabularies and their flexibility are both necessary and frequently more reflective of the communities that you're serving. And keep in mind that no matter which name is fixed, gay men, lesbians, LGBTQ plus people, other identities are emerging at the boundaries of what is going to be contained by this language. On the other hand, too many terms can be as bad as too few. That can make things very difficult to find if you've only got a few options that are popping up for each different term. A balance between the most inclusive language and what returns the best search results is going to be ideal. Broad, high-level terms are your friend, especially when used in combination with more specific terms or multiple points of description. So this process is happening all over the country. It's happening in our repository. My colleague at one, Lonnie Shibayama, was recently part of a group to update and improve inclusive description within one's collections and within the USC Library's collections. These are some examples of changes that were made within the subject headings. On the left are terms where the group kept both the current terms and added additional new terms. And on the right are places where they discarded outdated terms and replaced them with new LCSH terms. Now, as I said, it's about the work. It's about the doing. Archival description is an iterative process, especially inclusive description, and even more especially in LGBTQ plus description, because as I said, the language is continually evolving. There's no real end to the work. What worked 20, 30 years ago doesn't work today. What works today is not going to necessarily work in the future. Archivists are continually working with context. and description and interpretation are going to change over the time. So in doing this work, it's important to understand that it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to get it 100% right, or please 100% of people. The most important thing is that you're actually doing this. We say it all the time in archives, perfect is the enemy of good. It's far more important to have the information out there and accessible than for it to be absolutely perfect. And as long as you're open to feedback from your users and from the community and are willing to adjust your description as needed, you are well on your way to making improvements. I have included a list of resources that you may find helpful. Some of these are articles that speak to the why of how this work and can assist with framing of inclusive description projects. And others are guides and glossaries that lend themselves to the how of it all. I'm going to be sending my slides out after the presentations, so you'll be able to peruse these at your leisure. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And once again, I'm going to introduce Isaac Fellman and Megan Needles to talk about their experiences updating and expanding subject headings at the GLBT Historical Center. And Isaac, if you want to share your screen.
Nice. Slideshow mode, we're at the beginning. What more can we possibly ask for? Megan, you're seeing this? It's loaded up okay?
Yep, I see it.
All right.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about developing the subject terms and custom controlled vocabulary that we use at the GLBT Historical Society. I am Isaac Fellman. I use he, him pronouns. I am the reference archivist at the Society.
And hey, I will just introduce myself. My name is Megan Needles. I use they, them pronouns. And yes, as Beth mentioned, I previously worked at the GLBT Historical Society as a project archivist, and I am currently with the Prelinger Archives and work as an archivist. So I guess, yeah, so perfect. Thank you, Isaac. So here's our agenda for the talk. First, we're going to provide some background on the GLBT Historical Society, as well as a little bit of context for this project. And then we'll touch on the framework used in approaching this work. Next, we'll discuss some common challenges in describing LGBTQ collections. And lastly, we'll just talk about our process developing our subject terms, and we'll share some strategies that we use to address the common challenges when describing LGBTQ collections with controlled subject terms. Next slide, please. So the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, or GLBT Historical Society was founded in 1985 and is recognized as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Their mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. The Dr. John P. DeSecco Archives and Special Collections of the GLBT Historical Society are among the largest and most extensive holdings in the world of materials pertaining to LGBTQ people. They occupy more than 4,000 linear feet of storage, and broadly speaking, their over 1,000 collections include personal papers, organizational records, periodicals, oral histories, photographs, audiovisual recordings, ephemera, artifacts, and works of art. Next slide. I think that's you, Isaac.
Starting a timer to stop me from rambling forever. I'm going to take the middle portion of this and we'll meet up with Megan again. So a little bit of background on this project that we embarked on. In 2020, archive staff found that the terms we were using to describe queer people did not adequately represent our collections, especially trans collections. I'll get into why trans collections were sort of the thing that spurred this a little bit later. But in response to these various concerns that we were finding, we created the first version of our controlled subject term. Before this, the society had a couple of informally used iterations of this, but this was the first time that we created a centralized. So I just wanted to find a couple of terms and give a little background for those in the audience who may not be archivists or who just may not use these terms exactly the way that I do. I think that a side effect of a lot of archivists working alone and in pairs is that we start developing idiosyncratic ways of using it. So what are subject terms? If you have been on the copyright page of the book, you have seen subject terms. As you can see with this one, gay communities, California, San Francisco history. We've got some about, the history of politics and government, the history of Castro. Libraries will generally tag materials in the library with materials with words drawn from the Library of Congress subject headings, which are the most common sort of list of words that librarians have agreed upon to use for the same reasons. Subject terms at GLBTHS look a little bit different, partly because we don't use LCSH terms for quite a lot of what we do. Again, I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but for us, our catalog entries, this one is tagged with lesbians, oral history, LGBTQ, and Sonoma County. So here is why. But first, also, I really wanted to talk about how subject terms are a flawed project that I struggle with a lot of the time. When I think about trying to participate in the project of like library taxonomy, I think a lot about how the Dewey Decimal System, whose first edition was in 1876, was, in my view, it was very much a Victorian and imperialist project to name and classify and thus control the world. When I think about this moment in history, I think about white British and American men trying to make a list of all the kinds of people and things and animals in the world, and thus asserting their dominance over them in a very real way, deciding that they are the ones who get to decide what kinds of people and things exist. The culture of libraries in particular is built upon the work of Melville Dewey, who was a deeply flawed man. He was notorious in his own time as a sexual harasser, racist and anti-Semite, and a man with intensely essentialist beliefs about what made women in particular suited to be librarians. Thought that women were friendly and good at following instructions. And when I think about how the system that most public libraries use to describe topics to this day is a direct descendant of this man's ideas about the world, it troubles me. And at the same time, I can't think of a better way for libraries to organize themselves than by lists of terms, taxonomies of ideas. That stuff is deeply ingrained into our field, and it's not going to change now. So what we can do is refuse to be described and instead insist upon describing ourselves. If we need to describe people who are not ourselves, people who don't resemble our own experiences, it behoves us to do deep and thoughtful research and speak to members of communities so that we can understand how people want to be described. So, what is a controlled vocabulary? A list of terms that a library or archive uses consistently. Here are some listings from the controlled vocabulary that we use at GLBTHS that we developed after 2020. Subject terms have a bunch of uses in their limitation and consistency. They help researchers find materials. Of course, you search for a term, you find the term. They help refine searches. Anyone who's used a library catalog has probably noticed that there are faceting terms that often come up after you've searched a term. You can narrow it down. If I'm searching for lesbians in the GLBT Historical Society's archival catalog, I can also facet that to find out just about lesbian sports. I can click on the word sports, and now I have exactly what I need. Controlled vocabularies help us do this by just limiting the number of terms that we use to tag things. They also, of course, make sure materials are described consistently, which is good in and of itself. So why did this effort that we took start with trans collections? Why was that the place where we started to notice like faults and cracks in the way that we were doing it? Some of this material has been already covered by Beth, so I'm going to go over it a little bit more quickly. But trans collections were the thing that brought up the concerns because their evolution of trans terms happens really fast for a bunch of reasons. One of which is that cultural definitions of transness are always shifting. There are both within and outside of the community. As late as the 90s, for example, it was very, very common to speak of trans identity as a split between transvestites and transsexuals. You were always either a person who was usually assigned male at birth and who was driven as a hobby or as a pleasure or as simply as a desire to, experience womanhood through clothing. Or you were a transsexual and you wanted to medically transition, but there wasn't supposed to be overlap between the two groups. Over time, especially in the late 90s, we began to evolve into the understanding of transness that we have today, which is more about a continuum and a set of behaviors and a set of desires that is not rigid and binary in that sense. By contrast with the speed by which trans terms evolve, the Library of Congress subject headings evolve really slowly. As Beth was pointing out, they do evolve and change, but there is a lot of bureaucratic work. The Library of Congress works for Congress and answers to Congress. So there are also a number of political difficulties that need to be gotten over before terms can change. Terms for trans people evolve rapidly between being euphemisms, polite terms, and insults. In the 90s, for example, tranny was an in-group term that was friendly, appreciative, loving, sort of an umbrella term that captured various aspects of trans experience. Eventually, people who don't like trans people got a hold of the term, and it became not only a slur, but a slur that I feel like I only have privilege to say because I'm a trans person. So because of these factors, trans terms become shibboleths. They demonstrate whether you're in touch with the community by whether you can use them. So it really shows up in your catalog if you are still saying transsexual. Brings me to the golden rule of archives terminology. Beth also spoke to this very eloquently. Call people what they want to be called. And when you're developing a controlled vocabulary, it's rule number one, it's rule number two, it's rule. When you're developing such a vocabulary as well, it's inevitably going to bring up concerns. And again, that the perfect is the enemy of the good answer to most of these concerns that I have. What are the most respectful terms to use? How to deal with terms shifting? How do we respect people's lived identities when the understanding of those identities has evolved? Megan is going to get into this later. And lastly, what if we offend people? What if we harm people? To this, I can only say I have made mistakes in the creation of our controlled vocabulary, which was originally my brainchild. Now several people work on it. And the answer that I've always found is to keep listening to members of the community. If people complain, listen to and address their complaints by changing your practices. And also actively ask, if you're on good terms with a researcher and you're working well together. I've asked, do people in your community call themselves this? And it's led to improvements in the system. So people are going to respond well, I think, generally to being listened to and asked. I know I respond to it well. Sometimes it's a difficulty and a burden to be asked to speak for my community, especially when my community is an umbrella that encompasses so many people whose experiences are nothing like mine. But we can help each other to address each other in a kind way. So, checking time, sorry. Great. When the GLBT Historical Society was developing our local list of terms, we followed a couple of ground rules. One of which is that we were going to kind of not use the LCSH constantly because, we were finding situations where I think that this may have actually changed since then, but at the time they were using bisexuals for bisexual people. They really didn't have a concept of non-binary identity at all. And so for the beginning, we were like, we're going to go off-road about this, but we're also going to use LCSH whenever we possibly can, just because it's interoperable. It speaks to other libraries' catalogs. If people are using the Online Archive of California where our catalog is hosted, we want them to be able to search for a term and find our stuff as well as other people's stuff. It's not findable, it's defeating the purpose. So we are going to start with LCSH and modify when we can. And we're also going to do a bunch of research to determine terms that are in use by communities, both queer communities, trans communities, communities of color, religious communities. And so in addition to just having personal conversations and drawing from our own background and experience, we drew upon the GLAAD Media Reference Guide. We drew upon Homosaurus, which is a project spearheaded by a number of people in the queer archives community. The Digital Transgender Archives crew is heavily involved with Homosaurus. We didn't want to just adopt Homosaurus straightforwardly because it's a really huge vocabulary, and we wanted to limit things a little bit more so that we weren't using a million different terms that, again, were often synonyms, but we definitely drew upon it. We also looked at a lot of journalistic style guides. This was one of the big discoveries that I really appreciated about this project. The fact that most groups of marginalized people in the US have an Associated Journalists Association. Like there are people who work in media who have a really strong vested interest in saying to their colleagues, come on, here's how you talk about me and people like me. And, frankly, now that I've created this style guide, you don't have an excuse to do something else. So in terms of finding terms that were polite and that represented at least a degree of consensus. Sometimes there isn't a consensus between like a group of people. A lot of the time there isn't about what to call themselves, which is part of the reason that we tag collections about Indigenous Americans, American Indians, Native Americans, and Indigenous people, which are not fully interchangeable terms, but all of which are polite terms for Indigenous Americans. And we want people to be able to find from a search for any one of these correct terms. So yeah, drawing upon style guides for that. And from there, we created our own internal style guide, which has sort of this list of like if then statements, basically. If a person explicitly identified as non-binary, for example, tag with non-binary people, otherwise see gender nonconformity, which again, we're going to talk about a little bit later. The ways that we differentiated between what a person identifies as and what things that they did, especially if we don't know how they identify. There are also notes about when something isn't in the LCSH, they probably need updating at this point, but they were accurate as of the last time we did a mass overhaul of this, which was about a year ago. I think this is time for over to you, Megan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about some of the practices and strategies that the GLBT Historical Society uses in describing their collections. So one practice that was implemented is to tag all collections and assets with the term LGBTQ. And this is in service of the discoverability of these resources on harvester sites, such as Calisphere and the Digital Public Library of America. In general, in the past, a general LGBTQ term was not used just because it seemed like an assumed topic within the context of the GLBT Historical Society archive. However, as workflows continue to be developed to have collections harvested, we realized the general term was important in ensuring that these resources were discoverable on those sites. And I should also note that we did need to use an alternative term other than the LCSH term, which was considered clinical and not in use within the community. And I also wanted to note that Kelly Boulding, in their talk on culturally competent archival description, suggests a strategy of using umbrella terms such as LGBTQ as a way to tag ambiguous collections as of interest to LGBTQ plus researchers instead of labeling the creator or subjects with specific contemporary identity terms. And this is useful when there simply isn't enough information to determine how someone identified, or perhaps if there isn't enough maybe subject expertise to say with confidence how someone identified. Next slide, please. I think it's one more back. Yeah, thank you. Another strategy I'll share has to do with marking contemporary and historical identities. So as Beth and Isaac have mentioned already, there are certain identities that exist today and that researchers are interested in learning about, but that did not exist in the past. And one prime example of this is that of non-binary, genderqueer, or gender fluid identities. The GLBT Historical Society doesn't assign identity terms to archival subjects if they did not explicitly use them, or the contemporary equivalent term to identify with. Because of this, we don't have many collections that include the non-binary subject term, but that doesn't mean we don't have collections that are relevant to non-binary history. So in order to make those collections discoverable to folks interested in that history without assigning specific identity subject terms to their collections, we took a page from the folks at the Digital Transgender Archives book, and we think of the concept of gender nonconformity as a practice instead of a specific identity category. And we use that as an umbrella term to describe folks who did not conform to the historical or the contemporary gender binary. And so the Sylvester collection at the GLBT Historical Society, who was a famous disco R&B singer, is a great example of when we would use this term. Sylvester was known for his androgynous appearance and his falsetto singing voice. He was a gay man and he did not identify as transgender, but also did not consider himself a drag queen. It's easy to make assumptions that he might have identified as genderqueer or non-binary, should those terms have existed while he was alive, but we consider that unethical and to assign those terms to him posthumously. So the umbrella term gender nonconformity is used to indicate that Sylvester did not conform to the gender binary of his time and makes this collection discoverable to folks interested in that history. The next slide, please. And another example of how GLBTHS approaches marking contemporary and historical identities is with collections relating to trans people. There have been many different terms used throughout history to describe trans identities, but in many cases, these terms have now fallen out of common use and can be considered offensive by contemporary users. So as a way to approach the description of trans collections with an ethics of care framework, the term transgender people is used as an umbrella subject term for anyone who is not cisgender. The description field and note fields are then used to include historical identity terms so that those terms are still searchable, but where we can also provide ample context about the significance of the terms. So the term transgender people in the GLBTHS controlled vocabulary includes people who identified primarily as cross-dressers, transsexuals, and FTM or MTF, amongst other identity terms. And when including context about historical identity terms, people first language is used. Next slide, please. So I just want to provide an example of how you might see a historic identity term be contextualized in a notes or description field. The image on the right is a brochure from the Finocchio's collection, which was a famous drag venue in North Beach here in San Francisco. Finocchio's opened in the early 1930s and began featuring female impersonation shows during the Prohibition era. The term female impersonators appears extensively throughout this collection, but it is an outdated term that contemporary users might not be familiar with or who might be offended by its usage. So for this reason, a note is included on the digital collections page for this collection that contextualizes the term. And it says the term female impersonators is a historic term that comes from straight-coded Victorian theatrical form and continued until the mid-20th century before merging into what we now call drag. Finocchio's performers included what we now know of as drag queens, trans people, and cis people in drag. Next slide, please. And the last strategy I mentioned is one that has also been touched upon already, but it just has to do with an acknowledgement of the fluidity in the ways that people and communities describe themselves over time. GLBTHS archive staff continues to evaluate subject terms with some regularity and are prepared to change them as appropriate. And this goes against the sort of essence of controlled vocabularies, which is concerned with rigidity and fixedness, but ultimately we want to center and prioritize our users, their ability to discover things within collections, and their needs over what might be considered, archival best practice or what is most efficient. In some cases, 2 or 3 terms are used for one subject, and that is because we determine that there are multiple terms that are still in common use within a community, and we want to recognize and accommodate that. And we also make ourselves open to researcher input when it comes to subject terms and other descriptive practices. Researchers in some cases are subject and community experts, and we value their thoughts and opinions when it comes to description. And as a small organization with limited staff resources, we do anticipate that subject terms included on finding aids will become outdated over time. So in anticipation for this, a note is also included on all finding aids that states that that GLBTHS finding aids use terminology for LGBTQ people that was current at the time of their creation, and that descriptive language for queer identities evolves quickly over time. And it also invites researchers to contact staff with feedback or questions. And yeah, lastly, we're open to sharing our subject term definitions and the reasoning behind our descriptive practices with researchers and archival practitioners and working groups as we are now who are interested. And, this work just can't be done in a vacuum and requires community engagement in order to succeed. And I think that's it.
Yeah, and this is us. If you want to get in touch with either of us with questions about this, you can also just look me up on the GLBT Historical Society website. And yeah, I'm going to stop and share.
Well, Isaac, Megan, thank you so much. And regarding Isaac's last statement, he also has agreed to share the Historical Society's current controlled vocabulary and subject headings. So I will be sending that out to participants so you can see I hesitate to use the word final product, but what they have been working with lately and what the product that they have been developing is. So we are now open for questions, Q&A. You can raise your hand. You can put a note in the chat. We welcome questions from anyone, everyone. So please. You want to just say something, you can unmute yourself and
while people are formulating, I just want to say this is the best attended seminar about archival nomenclature that I've ever seen. Just thank you so much for showing up. It's been really lovely.
yes. So I have a question from Emily Salzer. So I'm curious if anyone has come across helpful resources or writing about this issue's relationship to Spanish translation, either about using English to describe LGBTQ plus materials that are in Spanish or about presenting English language LGBTQ materials to Spanish speaking audiences.
It's a really good question. I don't think I have an answer myself.
Emily, I believe I came across a related article when I was doing research for this. I will see if I can track it down and I will forward it to you. I have not seen a lot about this so far, but I would be very curious myself to see what kind of work has been done in this way, especially Southern California and Los Angeles and the Latino communities down here. Anybody?
Are any of you members of groups, Kim asks, who regularly discuss additions and thoughts? Only internally here at the Society right now. I do know that there are a couple of independent projects that are working on developing, I really should know more about this than I do, more industry-wide queer subject term. I'm not currently involved in any of that.
As I said, I have not been involved myself, but there was a working group at USC who they are still talking about things, but I don't know what kind of regular meetings they're doing there. We also have a question from Jacqueline, said, can you speak to your methodology for maintaining the vocabulary? Which I think is going to be an Isaac question.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like what we should be doing next is developing a regular timetable for going through the vocabulary and just making sure that all the things that we assert in it are still true. Right now, it tends to be something of a case by case. When I have a conversation with a researcher about a term that we could improve, or when I happen to be doing some work with collections on a particular topic and I think, I should probably go in and make sure that I have better backup for the things that I'm actually asserting in here. For example, it was relatively recently that I improved the terms about Indigenous people and found an actual style guide, in this case, another press style guide. to make sure that those were reflected in reality. Previously, I had just done some like more casual Google research into like the names and usages of various like activist groups. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think that in the future we should start looking at it quarterly and just sort of going over thinking, as the LCSH term evolved on this point, we need to start using an LCSH term where we weren't previously because now there's a good one. Can we back up things with citations more? And also, are terms slipping away from us? Like a recent example is that we've been using the LCSH term fat acceptance movement, but researchers tell me that fat activism is the universally used term within the community. And I just find that the slippage from saying acceptance to activism seems really emblematic of the way that a lot of terms about activism have been moving in past years. So yes, it's definitely a living document, but I feel like its heartbeat could be a little bit stale.
I think Lonnie has a question.
Yeah, so thank you, Isaac and Megan, both for this really great presentation. I don't want to keep people too long. I know we're at the end, but I just wanted to ask quickly about how you deal with alternative names, particularly for trans people, and how you decide to make alternative names either public or at least internal, and how your approach to that.
Sure. With a few exceptions, we will use a person's final name that they use. We sort of generally assume that most trans people are people who have changed their names also for other reasons. We have people who have adopted their stage name as their daily name, for example, who don't want you to use their previous name. So we will treat someone's final name as their sort of definitive and canonical one. Our take has always been that if you really want to find out someone's old name, it's probably in the collection. So you can go in there. The exception that I was talking about is if a person really was equally well known under their previous name. Most of the people in our collections are not famous, so we don't have to deal with this very often. But I'm imagining, if Elliot Page's papers for some reason made their way to our collection, we might consider mentioning his former name in the finding aid in the catalog, just because people are going to be searching for it. His former name, he had a long career under it. It will always be known. But by and large, just in the same sense that I personally would not want people to say, like Isaac Fellman, who was born under the name blah, 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 blah in 1982. It's just kind of extraneous and unnecessary information, I think, compared to the facts of the person's life.
Okay, so does anyone have any other comments or questions? Nope, we are at time, but we've got a few more. If not now, as Isaac and Megan and I have said, if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to email any or all of us. We are happy to have further discussions about this with anyone, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their week. Thank you so much for coming. As Isaac said, this was a really fantastic turnout, and we were very excited to see and talk with you all. So thank you so much. Hope everyone has a wonderful day.